Um, today I will be bringing to you. Today I will be bringing to you a performance of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, um, with uninvited commentary. I have to produce an analysis for copyright reasons. Anyhow, why read Geoffrey Chaucer? Well, Geoffrey Chaucer is regarded as one of the first poets, one of the first great poets of English poetry. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that no one was writing poems in English before that? No, I just think it's because the Western canon, as it's constructed, really centers upon the genius of the individual male poet and his masterpieces. So, if you think about the Renaissance, you really had like Raphael and Michelangelo, and in part, these geniuses are a kind of like construction that is like retroactively constructed by critics, because very often a lot of these works were collaborative pieces, um, but for the sake of stitching it all together into one sort of like coherent narrative, the Harold Blooms and Camille Paglias of the world have to kind of, have to attribute the work to one author. Before Chaucer, a lot of poets were writing as anonymous. They were like dedicating their plays, their morality plays, to God and not to themselves. But there's a real focus upon the ego of the individual in Chaucer. He, well, first of all, it's one of the first chivalric romances to happen to the first person. Before that, a lot of writers were writing romances about knights going on quests, winning the heart and honor of their beloved by doing difficult tasks. But in this in this poem, Chaucer is relaying a tale that happens to himself. So without further ado, let's get into it, and I'll stop for commentary. Hope it's not too tedious. The prologue. When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower, when also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales an air in every grove and heath, upon the tender shoots, and the young sun his half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them, and their heart engages, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give his help to them when they were sick. So already, does this remind you of another poem? That's right, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I think it goes like, April is the cruellest month of the year, stirring lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory with desire, um, something about stirring up dull roots. And in that poem, it's like, okay, why is April the cruelest month of the year? Because in the northern hemisphere, that's spring. That's a nice month. Um, if you've ever lived through winter in New York, like, that is cruel. Like, I wouldn't want to be homeless in New York during the middle of January. Like, it's really rough. Um, you really get a sense that, like, just of the power of nature, even in the metropolis, because it's like, if you stay outside for long enough, you will die. So why would spring be a cruel month? Well, for T.S. Eliot, he'd just come back from World War One. A lot of his friends have died, and there's this sort of like bittersweet moment where it's like, yes, he has survived to see another spring, and spring is the time of regeneration. It's the month of Easter, and yet a lot of his friends didn't make it, so the memory of his friends weighs heavy on his mind. Now, similarly, why would spring be a time for Chaucer to be writing? Well, I think this was written in 1386, could be wrong, but 1346, the Black Death sweeps through England. So this really is a post-pandemic narrative. Speaking of post-pandemic narratives, I have just written a play that is set in a warehouse during COVID-19. It's called Chinese Restaurant, and if you're in Sydney during the month of June, it'll only be on for 2 nights. June 19th and 20th, look up Chinese Restaurant by Aubrey Wang, and come to my play. It's a realist play in the Chekhov tradition, about just sort of like, it's a satire of the middle class. Don't want to spoil it too much. And also, anyway, turning our attentions back to the Canterbury Tales. So, down to Canterbury they wend to seek the holy blissful martyr. St. Thomas Becket, after his execution in the 12th century, he was a huge sort of like advocate for the church against Henry II. Don't really know what their whole beef is, but for a long time after that, people loved Thomas Becket, and during the plague they prayed to him, and like sometimes he appeared to them in visions, curing them of their ills. I don't know if that's really how it went, but I don't know. This was the Middle Ages, and magic was real and alive, and God was, afoot. So people saw the Holy Virgin Mary in apparitions. So if you've ever seen, what's that movie? The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman. I think it may actually have been heavily inspired by the Canterbury Tales. That's about the Middle Ages, about this ragtag crew of characters who go on a quest during the Black Death. But I think that's set in some Nordic country. Anyway, in Southwark, at the Tabard, as I lay ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into that hostelry some 29 in a company of sundry folk, happening then to fall in fellowship, and they were pilgrims all, that towards Canterbury meant to ride. The rooms and stables of the inn were wide, they made us easy, all was of the best, and, briefly, when the sun had gone to rest, I'd spoken to them all upon the trip, and was soon one with them in fellowship, pledged to rise early and to take the way to Canterbury, as you heard me say. But none the less, while I have time and space, before my story takes a further pace, it seems a reasonable thing to say what the condition was, the full array of each of them, as it appeared to me, according to profession and degree. So according to what their jobs were and what their rank in society was, whether they were secular or a member of the clergy. And at a night, that's night with a K, I therefore will begin. There was a knight, a most distinguished man, who from the day on which he first began to ride abroad had followed chivalry, truth, honour, generousness, and courtesy. He had done nobly in his sovereign's war, and ridden into battle no man more, as well in Christian as in heathen places, and ever honoured for his noble graces. So, what the prologue does is it's really like the pilot of a TV show. It introduces you to the characters. This really is an ensemble comedy. Um, and the comedy of the Canterbury Tales really revolves around types. So, um, there's a lot of like recognizable archetypes that Chaucer would have expected his audience to recognize. Um, for example, when talking about the Um, what's a good example? I'm so sorry. I've had a lot of beans. What's a good example? The cook, or oh yeah, the Franklin. Basically, the Franklin is like this drunk guy with a ruddy face, with like a reddish complexion. He's a redhead. He loves to drink, loves to loves to make love to beautiful women, and everyone's like, and everyone would have been like when they read this, oh yeah, we have a bunch of those at the local. Anyway, so he's just introducing you to um, the coat of all colours that he is stitching up. When we took Alexandria, he was there, he being the knight. He often sat at the table in the chair of honour above all nations, when in Prussia, in Lithuania he had ridden, and Russia. No Christian man so often of his rank, when in Granada Algeciras sank. That's Algeciras? By the way, the closing down of Al Jazeera by the government of a particular legitimate state. It's a travesty. Boo. Al Jazeera sank under assault. He had been there, and in North Africa raiding Benamarin. In Anatolia he had been as well, and fought when Aias and Italia fell. For all along the Mediterranean coast he had embarked with many a noble host. So this knight has been on many campaigns. He had embarked with many a noble host. In 15 mortal battles he had been, and jousted for our faith at Tramacene, thrice in the lists, and always killed his man. This same distinguished knight had led the van, once with the Bey of Balat, doing work for him against another heathen Turk. He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished, he was wise. So what was happening in the 14th century? The Ottomans invade Europe. So who are the Ottomans? They're they're the ancestors of the modern day Turkish people, but they really originated out of Central Asia. So if you think of like Uzbekistan, Mongolia, the steppes, kind of like to the east of the Balkans, like more kind of like in the Caspian Sea region. So there was a huge kind of like fear of the Turks at this point. And this relates back to T.S. Eliot's poem. So Chaucer writing at the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, Eliot writing at the end of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire gets sort of like dissolved after the end of World War One. Gallipoli, really the beginning of our sort of like national consciousness, our national military consciousness. Gallipoli, some would say a necessary campaign. They had to conquer the Dardanelles, but they landed on the wrong beach. Can't say I would have done a better job. So, who am I to judge? He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished, he was wise, and in his bearing modest as a maid. He never yet a boorish thing had said, in all his life to any, come what might. He was a true, a perfect, gentle knight. Speaking of his equipment, he possessed fine horses, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a fustian tunic stained and dark, with smudges where his armour had left mark. Just home from service, he had joined our ranks to do his pilgrimage and render thanks. He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In stature he was of a moderate length, with wonderful agility and strength. He'd seen some service with the cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, Flanders Field. The choppers are coming! And had done valiantly in little space of time in hope to win his lady's grace. He was embroidered like a meadow bright, and full of freshest flowers, red and white. Singing he was, or fluting all the day, he was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, the sleeves were long and wide, he knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He was as he could make songs and poems and recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. He loved so hotly that till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale. So yeah, young man full of testosterone. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. There was a yeoman with him at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and hood of green, and peacock-feathered arrows bright and keen, and neatly sheathed hung at his side the while, for he could dress his gear in yeoman style. He had a jaunty dirk, spear sharp, and well equipped, a medal of St. Christopher he wore. So St. Christopher, that's the patron saint of travellers. Of shining silver on his breast, and bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. There also was a nun, a prioress. Her way of smiling very simple and coy. Her greatest oath was only by St. Loy, and she was known as Madame Eglantine, and well she sang a service with a fine intoning through her nose, as was most seemly, and she spoke most daintily in French, extremely, after the school of Stratford Adelbow. French in the Paris style she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught withal, no morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dipped her fingers in the sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lip so clean that not a trace of grease was to be seen. So obviously this bit, even though it's trying to remain PG-13, there's some innuendos. First of all, Stratford Adelbow, she only knows how to speak the French of Stratford Adelbow. That's a red light district in London. It's like a really rough area. So what is she doing as a prioress? That's kind of like, it's like the headmistress of a priory. It's like a Catholic school for girls. So yeah, maybe she's not so. It's like, is he really describing a nun? Because he's really objectifying this woman. Anyway. Upon the cup when she had drunk to eat, she reached her hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, a stately bearing fitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. As for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous, she used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding, and she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh, or milk, or fine white bread, and bitterly she wept if one were dead, or someone took a stick and made it smart, She was all sentiment and tender heart. Her veil was gathered in a seemly way, her nose was elegant, her eyes glass grey, her mouth was very small, but soft and red, her forehead certainly was fair of spread. Almost a span across the bow, I own, she was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had a graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads, the gaudies tricked in green, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and lower, amor vincit omnia. So, amor vincit omnia means love conquers all. It's like, that's a weird motto for a nun to be wearing. What else is there? So the listing of her qualities, that's what is known in literature as a blazon, often found in the French chivalric romance. It's kind of just like an itemized list of all of the sexy parts of your beloved. It's often addressed to a woman, but in Shakespeare's sonnets to a young man, bit of brotherly action happening there. Another nun, the secretary at her cell, was riding with her, and 3 priests as well. A monk there was, one of the finest sort, who rode the country. Hunting was his sport, a manly man, to be an abbot able. Many a dainty horse he had in stable. His bridle when he rode a man might hear, jingling in a whistling wind as clear. Aye, and as loud as does the chapel bell, where my lord monk was prior of the cell. The rule of good Saint Bennet or Saint Maur, as old and strict, he tended to ignore. He let go by the things of yesterday, and took the modern world's more spacious way. He did not rate that text at a plucked hen, which says that hunters are not holy men, and that a monk uncloistered as is a mere fish out of water, flapping on the pier. That is to say, a monk out of his cloister, that was a text he held not worth an oyster. Back then, oysters were very cheap. Oysters were food for poor people. And he's saying, we're back. I'm going to abridge the next part and select for interest, just because I'm making brownies and I have to go to the shops to get cacao powder. Okay, so we've met the monk who hunts for some reason. Like that's his whole thing, is his hobby of hunting. Like hunting was seen as this hedonistic or like indulgent thing to do, and I guess that's why it was inappropriate for a monk to be seen hunting. And we've met the prioress. Okay, we're gonna meet the friar next. There was a friar, a wanton one and merry, a limiter, a very festive fellow. In all 4 orders there was none so mellow, so glib with gallant phrase and well-turned speech. He'd fixed up many a marriage, giving each of his young women what he could afford her. He was a noble pillar to his order. Highly beloved and intimate was he with county folk within his boundary, and city dames of honour and possessions, for he was qualified to hear confessions. Or so he said, with more than priestly scope, he had a special license from the Pope. Sweetly he heard his penitents at shrift, with pleasant absolution for a gift. He was an easy man in penance giving, where he could hope to make a decent living. It's a sure sign whenever gifts are given to a poor order that a man's well shriven, and should he give enough he knew in verity, the penitent repented in sincerity. So basically, it's a dishonest priest who sells indulgences, absolutions of the soul, basically saying, get out of hell free, selling like get out of hell free tickets, as long as people paid him. This is like, indulgences are one of the main points of disagreement that Martin Luther protested against in his 95 Thesis against the Papal Bull. And then the next part just goes on to talk about how he like is in every single tavern and knew every single innkeeper and barmaid better than lepers and scum and gutted dwellers do. Did we miss the doctor? No, we didn't. Okay. There was a merchant with a forking beard and motley dress. High on his horse he sat, upon his head a Flemish beaver hat. There was a merchant with a forking beard and motley dress. High on his horse he sat, upon his head a Flemish beaver hat, and on his feet daintily buckled boots. He told of his opinions and pursuits. In solemn tones he harped on his increase of capital. There should be sea police, he thought, upon the Harwich Holland ranges. He was expert at dabbling in exchanges. This estimable merchant had so set his wits to work, none knew he was in debt. He was so stately in administration, in loans and bargains and negotiation. He was an excellent fellow all the same. To tell the truth, I do not know his name. So that's like a businessman. Chinese businessman. Yes, stocks. I love your business strategies. I will increase my investment by 20%. An Oxford cleric, still a student though, one who had taken logic long ago, was there. His horse was thinner than a rake, and he was not too fat, I undertake. But he had a hollow look, a sober stare. The thread upon his overcoat was bare. He had found no preferment in the church, and he was too unworldly to make search for secular employment. By his bed he preferred, having read 20 books in red and black of Aristotle's philosophy, than costly clothes, fiddle or psaltery. Though a philosopher, as I have told, he had not found the stone for making gold. Whatever money from his friends he took, he spent in learning or another book, and prayed for them most earnestly, returning thanks to them thus for paying for his learning. His only care was study, and indeed he never spoke a word more than was in need. Formal at that, respectful in the extreme, short to the point and lofty in his theme, a tone of moral virtue filled his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. So here we have the unsuccessful scholar, just a really bookish bookworm, I guess. A sergeant at the law who paid his calls, wary and wise, for clients at St. Paul's. There also was, of noted excellence, discreet he was, a man to reverence. Or so he seemed, his sayings were so wise, he often had been justice of assize, by letters patent and in full commission. His fame and learning and his high position had won him many a robe and many a fee. There was no such conveyancer as he. All was fee simple to his strong digestion. Not one conveyance could be called in question. Though there was nowhere one so busy as he was less busy than he seemed to be. He knew of every judgment, case and crime, ever recorded since King William's time. He could dictate defences or draft deeds. No one could pinch a comma from his screeds, and he knew every statute off by rote. He wore a homely party-coloured coat, girt with a silken belt of pinstripe stuff. Of his appearance I have said enough. There was a Franklin with him, it appeared. White as a daisy petal was his beard. A sanguine man, high-coloured and benign. He loved a morning sup of cake and wine. He lived for pleasure and had always done, for he was Epicurus's very son, in whose opinion sensual delight was one true felicity in sight. As noted as St. Julian was for bounty, he made his household free to all the county. His bread, his ale, were finest of the fine, and no one had a better stock of wine. His house was never short of bake meat pies, of fish and flesh, and those in such supplies, it positively snowed with meat and drink, and all the dainties that a man could think. According to the seasons of the year, changes of dishes were ordered to appear. He kept fat partridges in coops beyond, many a bream and pike were in his pond. A haberdasher, a dyer, a carpenter, a weaver, and a carpet maker were among our ranks, all in the livery of one impressive guild fraternity. They were so trim and fresh that gear would pass for new. Their knives were not tricked out with brass, but wrought with purest silver, which avouches a like display on girdle and on pouches. Each seemed a worthy burgess fit to grace a guild hall with a seat upon the dais. They had a cook with them, who stood alone for boiling chicken with a marrow bone, sharp flavouring powder, and spice for savour. He could distinguish London ale by flavour, and he could roast and seethe and broil and fry, make good thick soup and bake a tasty pie. But what a pity, so it seemed to me, that he should have an ulcer on his knee. As for blancmange, he made it with the best. He could distinguish London ale by flavour. Well, I don't know. I feel like I can tell an IPA from an XPA or a lager. I don't know. I mean, I can't tell an XPA from an IPA. So, but I love a good stout. There was a skipper hailing from far west. He came from Dartmouth, so I understood. He rode a farmer's horse as best he could, in a woolen gown that reached his knee, a dagger on a lanyard falling free, hung from his neck under his arm and down. The summer heat had tanned his colour brown. A lanyard designates basically just a strip of leather worn around the neck. I would do anything for a lanyard. Like, I don't care about making art anymore. As long as people give me, like, a lanyard with my official position at the company on it, like, that's all I need. But many a draught of vintage, red and yellow, lol, a Carlton draught. He'd drawn at Bordeaux while the trader snored. The nicer rules of conscience he ignored. If, when he fought, the enemy vessel sank, he sent his prisoners home. They walked the plank. As for his skill in reckoning the tides, currents, and many another risk besides, moons, harbours, pilots, he had such dispatch that none from Hull to Carthage was his match. Hardy he was, prudent in the undertaking, his beard in many a tempest had its shaking, and he knew all the havens as they were, from Gotland to the Cape of Finisterre, in every creek in Brittany and Spain. A barge he owned was called the Magdalene. A doctor, too, emerged as we proceeded. So this is like a negative, derogatory portrait of a portrait. Of a portrait? Portrait of a portrait. Of a doctor who made a pretty penny off of the plague. No one alive could talk as well as he did on points of medicine and of surgery, for, being grounded in astronomy, he watched his patient closely for the hours when, by his horoscope, he knew the powers of favourable planets, and then ascendant, worked on the images for his dependent. The cause of every malady you'd got, he knew, and whether dry, cold, moist, or hot, he knew their seat, the humour and condition. He was a perfect practising physician. In the Middle Ages, medicine was grounded upon an understanding of the four humours. So you had dry, cold, moist or hot, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood, melancholic, cold. I don't know what cold was. Phlegmatic and sanguine, respectively. And personally, okay, so according to my horoscope, I would be phlegmatic. I'm definitely a water sign, like very going with the flow, but also emotional. Like Bruce Lee say, be like water. Melancholics are often described as corresponding to melancholic or black bile because they are just yeah, no, unlucky in their humours, and they don't go outside, they don't touch grass enough. And sanguine, if you remember the Franklin, he was like full of blood and like hot and fiery. Um, anyway, real like snake oil salesman kind of stuff. He was well versed in Asclepius too, and what Hippocrates and Rufus knew, and Dioscorides, now dead and gone, Galen and Rhazes, Harley, Serapion, Averroes, Avicenna, Constantine, Scotch Bernard, John of Gaddesden, Gilbertine. So that's just famous writers on medicine, famous physicians in the Middle Ages. Some were from antiquity, but inspired the medicine of the Middle Ages. A worthy woman from beside Bath City was with us, somewhat deaf, which was a pity. In making cloth she showed so great a bent, she bettered those of Ypres and of Ghent. In all the parish not a dame dared stir towards the altar steps in front of her, and if indeed they did, so wrath was she as to be put quite out of charity. Her kerchiefs were of finely woven ground. I dared have sworn they weighed a good 10 pound. The ones she wore on Sunday on her head, her hose were of the finest scarlet red, and gartered tight. Her shoes were soft and new. Bold was her face, handsome and red in hue, a worthy woman all her life. What's more, she'd had 5 husbands, all at the church door, apart from all the company in youth. No need to speak of that, forsooth. Yeah, you know, this very pious woman had 5 husbands, all kind of, you know, left her standing at the altar, besides, you know, all of the kind of like rootin' and bootin' around that she did in her teens. But don't worry, we don't need to speak of that. She'd been to Rome and also to Bologna, I don't know, St. James of Compostela and Cologne. And she was skilled in wondering, by the way. She had gap teeth, set widely, truth to say. I think like gap teeth was associated with promiscuity. Anyway, the most pious people are always the greatest. Trying to think of a word that's not a slur. Anyway, sex workers. So, yeah, she's been traveling. A lot of my friends, sex workers, have been traveling. Their work takes them places. It's like photography, it's like fashion photography. You get flown to New York and stuff. Easily on an ambling horse she sat, well wimpled up, and on her head a hat as broad as is a buckler or a shield. She had a flowing mantle that concealed large hips, her heels spurred sharply under that. In company she liked to laugh and chat, and knew the remedies for love's mischances, an art in which she knew the oldest dances. Mugwort and pennyroyal never did anyone any harm. That's the TikTok cure for abortion. A holy-minded man of good renown there was, and poor, the parson to a town. The parson is just like, this is just a description of like a genuinely good Marxist priest who believes in redistributive justice. Yet he was rich in holy thought and work. He also was a learned man, a clerk, who truly knew Christ's gospel, and would preach it devoutly to parishioners, and teach it, benign and wonderfully diligent, and patient when adversity was sent, for so he proved in much adversity. He hated cursing to extort a fee, nay rather he preferred beyond a doubt, giving to poor parishioners round about, both from church offerings and his property, he could in little find sufficiency. Wide was his parish, which with houses far asunder, yet he neglected not in rain or thunder, in sickness or in grief, to pay a call among the remotest, whether great or small. Upon his feet, and in his hand a stave, this noble example to his sheep he gave. That first he wrought, and afterwards he taught, and it was from the gospel he had caught those words, and he would add this figure too, that of gold rust, what then will iron do? For if a priest be foul in whom we trust, no wonder that a common man should rust. And shame it is to see, let priests take stock, a shitten shepherd and snowy flock. The true example that a priest should give is one of cleanness, how the sheep should live. He did not see his benefits to hire, and leave his sheep encumbered in the mire. There was a ploughman with him there, his brother, many a load of dung one time or another. He must have carted through the morning dew. He was an honest worker, good and true, living in peace and perfect charity. And, as the gospel bade him, so did he, loving God best with all his heart and mind, and then his neighbour as himself repined. The beginning of this verse seems as if it's setting the ploughman up for a joke. He's like, oh yeah, he likes to cart barrows of dung through the fields. And he's like, no, he's just a generally good guy, works with his hands, good honest man. There was a reeve, also a miller there, a college manciple from the Inns of Court, a palpable pardoner, and, in close consort, a church court summoner riding at a trot, and finally myself. That was the lot. The miller was a chap of 16 stone, a great stout fellow, big in brawn and bone. He did well out of them, for he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show. Broad, knotty, and short-shouldered, he would boast. He could heave any door off hinge and post, or take a run and break it with his head. His beard, like any sow or fox, was red. A manciple came from the inner temple, or caterers might follow his example. In buying victuals, he was never rash, whether he bought in credit or paid cash. He used to watch the market most precisely, and got in first, and so did quite nicely. Now isn't it a marvel of God's grace, that an illiterate fellow can outpace the wisdom of a heap of learned men? That an illiterate fellow can outpace the wisdom of a heap of learned men. His masters, he had more than 30 then, all versed in the abstrusest legal knowledge, could have produced a dozen from their college, fit to be stewards in land and rents and game, to be any peer in England you can name. So the manciple is kind of like the person who manages the finances at a university, which kind of reminds me of how, I'm not going to dox the university that I go to, but it's currently millions of dollars in debt, and our vice chancellor is like one of the most highly paid on a board of education in the state, and it seems to be that way too for many other unis in Sydney. Anyway, I don't have to get into it, but like the people who run my program, my course, my arts kind of units have been told by the people who manage the finances of the university that they need to make it more efficient and that they need to streamline the syllabus. And it's like, you are talking to a department full of people who like make it their life's work to just know one specific obscure English author. Like, that is the point of cultural studies, to know useless stuff. Like, that is the point of having these kind of disciplines at all. It's not meant to be efficient, but I guess everything has to be bug manified and technocratic, and you will own nothing and you will be happy. Anyway, sorry for the spiel. The reeve was old and choleric and thin. Oh yeah, cola was the other humour, so that's the cold one, I think. Choleric and thin, his beard was shaven closely to the skin. His shorn hair came abruptly to a stop above his ears, and he was docked on top, just like a priest in front. His legs were lean, like sticks they were, no calf was to be seen. He kept his bins and garners very trim, no auditor could gain a point in him, and he could judge by watching drought and rain, the yield he might expect from seed and grain. His master's sheep, his animals and hens, pigs, horses, dairies, stores, and cattle pens were wholly trusted to his government. And this is just about kind of like the same thing the CFO of like a manor, like a gentleman's piece of land. And he likes to skim off the top, but I'd argue that he deserves it, and he lives in a lovely dwelling on a heath, shadowed in green by trees above the sward, a better hand at bargains than his lord. He had grown rich, and had a store of treasure well tucked away, yet out it came to pleasure. But he keeps his lord satisfied with subtle loans or gifts of good. There was a summoner. So a summoner is like a policeman for the church. These are all like job descriptions that don't exist anymore. It's like, what? But basically the summoner summons you, brings you before the court for trespasses against for religious like crimes, basically, for like blasphemy or being a witch. There was a summoner with us at that inn, his face on fire like a cherubim, for he had carbuncles, his eyes were narrow, he was as hot and lecherous as a sparrow, black scabby brows he had, and a thin beard. Children were afraid when he appeared. No quicksilver, lead ointment, tartar creams, no brimstone nor boracic, so it seems, could make a salve that had the power to bite, clean up or cure his whelks of knobby white, or purge the pimples sitting on his cheeks. Garlic he loved, and onions too, and leeks. It's like, yeah, we get it. This is like a bad guy who, you know, just for a quart of wine, any good lad was allowed to keep a concubine. So it's like, it does pick and choose. Like, he doesn't really care about religion. He just kind of likes to get paid off and bribed for things. And it's like, yeah, we get this is a bad guy, but like, why make him have bad skin? Like, the next character that we'll meet is a gentle pardoner. He and a gentle pardoner rode together. A bird from Charing Cross of the same feather just came back from visiting the court of Rome. He loudly sang, "Came hither, come, love, come home." The summoner sang deep seconds to this song. No trumpet ever sounded half so strong. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, hanging down smoothly like a hank of flax. In driblets fell his locks behind his head, down to his shoulders, which they overspread. Thinly they fell like rat tails one by one. He wore no hood upon his head for fun. The hood inside his wallet had been stowed. He aimed at riding in the latest mode. But for a little cap, his head was bare, and he had bulging eyeballs like a hare. He sewed a holy relic upon his cap. His wallet lay before him on his lap, brimful of pardons come from Rome, all hot. He had the same small voice a goat has got. His chin no beard had harboured, nor would harbour, smoother than a chin left by a barber. I judge he was a gelding, or a mare. As to his trade, from Berwick down to where. So the gelding or a mare statement. Basically, here we have our queer-coded villain, the pardoner. The pardoner basically like serves. I think it's a like another kind of like indulgences. I may be wrong, but anyway, it's implied that he may be a castrato, which is this backwards practice they used to have during the Middle Ages, where to preserve the prepubescent voice of the choir boy, they would like neuter him. So either that or he's a trans guy. Sorry, not to insert the LGBT agenda into Geoffrey Chaucer, but Yeah. So yeah, he also has a bunch of like nice things, nice knickknacks from being a dishonest member of the clergy. Now I have told you shortly in a clause the rank, the array, the number, and the cause of our assembly in this company in Southwark at that high-class hostelry known as the Tabard, close beside the Bell, and now the time has come for me to tell how we behaved that evening. I'll begin after we had alighted at the inn, and then I'll report our journey stage by stage, or the remainder of our pilgrimage. But first I beg of you, in courtesy, not to condemn me as unmannerly if I speak plainly and with no concealings, and give account of all their words and dealings, using their very phrases as they fell, for certainly, as you'll know so well, he who repeats a tale after a man is bound to say, as nearly as he can, each single word, if he remembers it, however rudely spoken or unfit, or else the tale he tells will be untrue, the things he pretended and the phrases new. He may not flinch, although it were his brother. He may as well say one word as another, and Christ himself spoke broad in Holy Writ, yet there is no scurrility in it. Scurrility? Scurrility. Basically no like cunning there's no bad faith in it. And Plato says, for those with power to read, the word should be as cousin to the deed. Further, I beg you to forgive it me if I neglect the order and degree, and what is due to rank in what I've planned. I'm short of wit, as you will understand. Okay, so now we have been introduced to our cast, who will be taking us on an adventure with them on their pilgrimage, and it kind of really is like a sample of all of the kinds of people that you'd find in the Middle Ages. Like, it's almost like, you know how you can like choose who you want to be in Dungeons and Dragons? It's almost like these are the different roles that you can play. Are you going to be a member of the clergy? Are you going to be a priest? There's no wizards, unfortunately. It's very much a realistic. There's no magic realism just yet. And the pilgrimage is really a genius way of bringing all of these characters together in one situation. It's like this walks into a bar and they all tell each other stories. Like, it is kind of like a great setup for a sitcom involving everyone from all walks of life. And yeah, it really kind of like captures the entirety of life as it was experienced in the Middle Ages. It's like the War and Peace of the Middle Ages. Okay, so they all arrive at an inn and they meet the host of the inn, who is inspired by the journey and wants to come along. Now I have told you shortly in a clause the rank, the array, the number, and the cause of our assembly in this company in Southwark at that high-class hostelry known as the Tabard, close beside the Bell, and now the time has come for me to tell how we behaved that evening. I'll begin after we had alighted at the inn. Then I'll report our journey stage by stage, or the remainder of our pilgrimage. But first I beg of you, in courtesy, not to condemn me as unmannerly if I speak plainly and with no concealings, and give account of all their words and dealings, using their very phrases as they fell, for certainly, as you know so well, he who repeats a tale after a man is bound to say as nearly as he can each single word if he remembers it, however rudely spoken or unfit, or else the tale he tells will be untrue, the things pretended and the phrases new. He may not flinch, although it were his brother, he may as well say one word as another. And Christ himself spoke broad and holy writ, yet there is no scurrility in it, like no wile, no cunning. And Plato says, for those with power to read, the word should be as cousin to the deed. Further, I beg you to forgive it me if I neglect the order and degree, and what is due to rank in what I've planned. I'm short of wit, as you will understand. Yes, the old classic I'm retarded defense. Our host gave us great welcome. Everyone was given a place and supper was begun. He served the finest victuals you could think. The wine was strong, and we were glad to drink. A very striking man, our host withal, and fit to be a marshal in a hall. His eyes were bright, his girth a little wide. There is no finer burgess in Cheapside. Bold in his speech, yet wise and full of tact, there was no manly attribute he lacked. What's more, he was a merry-hearted man. After our meal, he jokingly began to talk of sport and, among other things, after we'd settled up our reckonings, he said as follows: "Truly, gentlemen, you're very welcome, and I can't think when. Upon my word, I'm telling you no lie, I've seen a gathering here that looked so spry, no, not this year, as in this tavern now. I'd think you up some fun if I knew how. And, as it happens, a thought has just occurred to please you, costing nothing, on my word. You're off to Canterbury. Yes, let's have fun, and it's for free. You're off to Canterbury. Well, Godspeed, blessed St. Thomas, answer to your need. And I don't doubt, before the journey's done, you mean to while the time in tales and fun. You mean to while the time in tales and fun. Indeed, there's little pleasure for your bones, riding along and all as dumb as stones. So let me then propose for your enjoyment, just as I said, a suitable employment. And if my notion suits and you agree, and promise to submit yourselves to me, playing your parts exactly as I say, tomorrow as you ride along the way, then by my father's soul, and he is dead, if you don't like it, you can have my head. Hold up your hands, and not another word." Well, our opinion was not long deferred. It seemed not worth a serious debate. We all agreed at any rate, and bade him issue what commands he would. "My lords," he said, "now listen, for your good, and please don't treat my notion with disdain, like this is the point. I'll make it short and plain. Each one of you shall help to make things slip by telling 2 stories on the outward trip to Canterbury. That's what I intend. And on the homeward way to journey's end, another 2 tales from the days of old, and then the man whose story is best told, that is to say, who gives the fullest measure of good morality and general pleasure. He shall be given a supper paid by all, here in this tavern, in this very hall, when we come back again from Canterbury, and in the hope to keep you bright and merry. I'll go along with you myself and ride all at my own expense and serve as guide. I'll be the judge, and those who won't obey shall pay for what we spend upon the way. Now, if you agree to what you've heard, tell me at once without another word, and I will make arrangements early for it." Yeah, so we're going to play a game. Each person tells 4 stories, 2 on the way there, 2 on the way back. Person who tells the best story, I'll be the judge, by the way. Meal on me when we get back. Hey. But hey, you have to tell these stories, because if you don't, then you're going to pay for the cost of our entire trip. And, you know, I've done Euro Summer. It's not a cheap undertaking. Of course, we all agreed. In fact, we swore to it delightedly, and made entreaty too that we should act as he proposed to do, become our governor in short, and be judge of our tales and general referee, and set the supper at a certain price. We promised to be ruled by his advice, come high, come low, unanimously thus we set him up in judgment over us. More wine was fetched, the business being done, we drank it off, and up went everyone to bed without a moment of delay. Early next morning, at the spring of day, up rose our host, and roused us like a cock, gathering us together in a flock, and off we rode at a slightly faster pace than walking to St. Thomas's watering place, and there our host drew up, and began to ease his horse, and said, "Now listen, if you please, my lords, remember what you promised me. If even song and matins will agree, let's see who shall be first to tell a tale. And as I hope to drink good wine and ale, I'll be your judge. The rebel who disobeys, however much the journey costs, he pays. Now draw for cut, and then we can depart. The man who draws the shortest cut shall start." "My lord the knight," he said, "step up to me and draw your cut, for that is my decree." and come you near, my lady prioress. And you, sir cleric, drop your shamefastness. No studying now. A hand from every man. Immediately the draw for lots began, and to tell shortly how the matter went, whether by chance or fate or accident, the truth is, the cut fell to the knight, which everyone greeted with delight. Because the knight is kind of like he's like the soldier, the veteran, the chad of the group. He's the jock, the popular guy. And tell his tale he must, as reason was, because of our agreement, and because he too had sworn. What more is there to say? For when this good man saw how matters lay, being by wisdom and obedience driven, to keep a promise he had freely given, he said, since it's for me to start the game, why, welcome be the cut in God's good name. Now let us ride, and listen to what I say. And at the word we started on our way, and in a cheerful style he then began at once to tell his tale, and thus it ran. And tune in, not next week, because next week I am doing, I don't know, a podcast. But yeah, tune in next time for The Knight's Tale, which is going to be the first story that is going to be told from the knight's perspective. Yeah, if you haven't booked tickets to my play, Chinese Restaurant, a post-pandemic play, much like the Canterbury Tales written after the Black Death, mine is written after COVID. Please do. It's going to be great, especially if you're a fan of Chekhov. The end.